Hello. Yes. So I hope everyone's doing well. Today we are going to be talking about the halo effect and McRaney number 3. Outstanding. Right. Okay. So the halo effect is a very interesting part of human life. And one of the interesting things about it is that although it's a cognitive bias, it isn't necessarily true that we want to get rid of it completely, right? So this course is called The Hijacked Brain, and we're interested in finding out how the brain can become kind of hijacked. And yet at the same time, we do want to keep in mind that some of these cognitive biases, as we call them, right, are part of what makes life enjoyable and full of fun and also imbue our connections with others with a special sort of magic. So we'll come back to that in a moment, right? But for right now, just keep that in mind. So in the beginning, right, there is height. So McRaney wants to remind us that an enormous, and I mean enormous, like a absolutely vast, huge tidal wave of research has been done on height, in part because it's fairly easy to show that height correlates with certain other aspects of human behavior. It's nice if you are a psychologist to find an effect that's pretty reliable and then demonstrate it. You know, it works well for from your own perspective, right? But that being said, it's important to know this, right? That height is that there's a certain fixation on height, not just in our own culture, but elsewhere. Like famously, um, some of these movie stars, perhaps whose very insecurity drives them to be so intense, right? And to grapple with these roles so ferociously that they really kind of pop off the screen. That these very movie stars are often being kind of their shortness is being compensated for by the camera. So in other words, you end up with a movie star with a sort of a so to speak a short man complex, right? Maybe a little overcompensatory, who is then elevated by the camera angles and, as McRaney says, in the old days and still to this day, just by standing on an apple crate next to his leading lady, looks the actor looks much bigger than he actually is, right? So the point here is not to get too fixated on height, but to note that a particular quality that someone has that is considered to be desirable, and height is one of them for us, for our culture, right? Can in fact lead to a generalized feeling of positivity, right? It's a halo effect after all. A halo as in like an angel, right? That this can have an overall effect on how we perceive a person and other characteristics about them, right? Which we know is a mistake, especially if you're in the business of trying to evaluate people professionally, or, in my case, as a teacher with a lot of students from different backgrounds, it's part of my job is to kind of try to some extent, account for this halo effect because I am evaluating students and I need to do so as fairly as possible, right? And there are lots of other professions in which that's the case. And you may well find yourself as a manager in life at some point trying to account for this halo effect. So it's a very useful thing to know about, generally speaking, right? Is this tendency that we have to engage in it. Right, one of the things that we need to know is that the halo effect is a kind of, especially the one around height, is particularly kind of hardwired, right? That, in other words, it's a form of pattern recognition. And that is part of what we need to acknowledge, right? That this pattern is present in our minds, and as are other patterns, right? That human beings, withdraw often from snakes or items that they perceive to be snakes before their conscious mind can recognize that this is either a stick or, in fact, a snake that is not dangerous. Humans are still kind of recoiling from this, right? And the theory here is that our brains needed labels, that is, quick forms that it could identify and react to before the conscious mind had a chance to process, right? And so when our feelings are not about snakes or creepy crawlies or dank swamps, but instead kind of about each other, right? It's called an affect, like from the same root as affection, right? So that we have a feeling that we just sort of react to or act upon unthinkingly and unquestioningly, right? When it comes to one another, then this is an affect. And we can say that this is true of height to some extent, right? Now, the point here is not that we should try to rid ourselves of this particular feature of our brain. If we could, it would be like totally changing what it means to be human. But it is to recognize that operating this way all the time and using these kinds of unthinking emotional responses to these patterns that we find desirable is a bit of a problematic method of living your life, right? And it can lead you to be in some deep doo-doo, so to speak, depending on what happens, right? So we know, and this is famously true, that humans are not very good at judging risk, that the things that terrify us or scare us come from our evolutionary past, right? And a lot of the things that we should find scary, various forms of cancer or lots of sort of problematic things that we ingest, these things are a function of the modern world, and our brain really hasn't had time to adjust to develop the same kinds of patterns that would drive us to have an instinctive reaction to features of the modern world, whereas we're still like very afraid of sharks, for example, when, of course, the probability of getting attacked by a shark, even from surfers or scuba divers, right, is very, very low. So we have a number of different affects that can change the way that we see people that surround us, and we're not necessarily very good at judging other things besides these affects, right? Which would be like judging the risk that a person might pose to us, or trying to evaluate this person in a different sort of way, right? So we know from a number of different experiments, right, that a certain muscle tone, vocal pitch, that is the sound of people's voices, and the way that they move. So we call this gait or walking gait. So the way that someone walks, that this can affect our view of them. That once again, this can kind of trigger a particular neural response, right, that can produce a behavioral change in the way that we see another individual. Now, this in turn has an effect on the individuals who have these particular traits. So famously, tall men are less jealous, less likely to provoke fights with someone who is flirting with their partner or whatever. But the point is that because this halo effect is so powerful from the way we look at others, it then can, since humans are social beings, right, it makes total sense that it would affect the way that humans view themselves. Okay, we'll come back in a second. Thanks.